Alright lads, lassies, welcome back to the YouTube, and today's video is effectively buying a wakeboard 101. Today's video is buying a wakeboard 101. So what do you need to look out for? Things like boat board versus cable board, sizing, fins, stance, rocker, all these things that might be a difficult thing to comprehend. I'm basically going to break them down, explain them, suggest what size board you should ride. And the most important thing is I'm not going to obviously try and sell you a board. I'm an O'Brien team rider. I've got my own pro model with them. These are actually old boards because I don't keep my boards here. But I'm not going to try and sell you a board. I'm just going to give you genuine independent advice. If you choose to buy an O'Brien board, then all the better. Anyway, let's get straight into it. First things first, boat board versus cable board. What are the key differences? Are there any differences? Can I ride my boat board on the cable or vice versa? And we're going to answer that question right now. So the long story short is the biggest difference between a boat board and a cable board is the core. So on a boat board, it's completely stiff. There's very little bend when you pull against it, whereas a cable board is quite flexible. Obviously, this is for kind of two reasons. The first is that it means on the rails you can get into nice little presses, but it also means when you're landing off a kicker onto flat water, the landing is a little bit softer. So that is the biggest difference, number one. The second biggest difference is to do with the bottom pattern. So I'm not going to speak specifically, but generally speaking, cable boards have an almost completely flat bottom, whereas a boat board will have these different grooves. Now, the grooves are to give you grip on the boat. In cable, people find that they kind of interfere and intervene when they're on an obstacle and they're pressing. What I will say is my personal advice, and all brands offer this, not just O'Brien. I personally like a board with a small channel here, and what that does is it just gives you a bit of traction. I found before when I ride completely flat boards on the cable, when I land, I just tend to slip out. So that would be my advice on the cable. Try and get something with a little bit of a groove, particularly if you're kind of beginner to intermediate, because you're not going to have the same kind of edge control. The next question that comes up quite often is, can I ride my boat board on the cable or can I ride my cable board on the boat? So let's start with your boat board on the cable. You absolutely can. You can do either. However, the boards are kind of designed specifically for one or the other. So the biggest problems you'll find riding a boat board on the cable is on the rails, it feels horrible. Like, it's really stiff. There's no kind of, it just doesn't feel good is what I'm trying to say. And it's also harder for progression. You can't get into nose presses. It doesn't feel as good. And also all the little grooves and the fins, which we'll talk about later, they interfere with your riding on the rails. The second thing that you'll notice is there's basically an impact base built into a cable board, whereas a boat board doesn't have it. So effectively your board's going to chip, it's going to scratch, it's going to wear away a lot faster than if you had a cable board. Another huge question that comes up is there such thing as a hybrid board? Loads of brands have come out with them. Personally speaking, I think one or the other is probably the best. Now, if you don't have enough money to buy both, which is completely fair, most people don't, I would actually say maybe lean towards a cable board, because I find a cable board is a little bit easier to ride on the boat than a boat board is to ride on the cable. Then if you're looking at doing that, definitely get one with some grooves, and also you can get some fins that attach in, and we'll talk more about fins later, but fins can help a huge amount on the boat if you're riding a cable board. In fact, on a boat, no matter what you're riding, you should probably have fins because it's going to help a lot. So that's my 2 cents with those. Now on to the next question. I don't actually know the next question, that's why I had to look it up. Okay. Next up, let's talk about fins. So this is obviously a big question. People never know, like, oh, do I ride with fins? My board came with fins in it. For example, the Valhalla that I ride, it comes with a fin that can go in the center. However, it has pretty big fins around the back. What do you do? So my general answer, let's begin with the boat, is small little fins on the outside are ideal. Most newish boards in the last 5 years have come with a small molded fin. However, if they don't, you can get anything from a 0.3 centimeter fin to a 0.7. I think some of them even go bigger. They're like a skeg almost. I would say smallish fins, so maybe like 0.3 to 0.5 is enough on the boat. When you get really advanced, you actually rarely use the fins because you're on your edge the whole time, but that's when you get advanced. On the cable, for the other hand, I would actually advise no fins ever. A lot of cable parks, I don't know if this is still a thing, but they used to not allow metal fins because they used to damage the obstacles. But generally speaking, I would say no fins is the solution on the cable. So yeah, that is fins. Next up is sizing. Now I'm going to put a chart on the screen throughout this, and it does differ from the boat to the cable, and it also is massively based around preference as long as you're within reason. So what I will say is, thankfully, most board manufacturers have a sizing chart on their website, so definitely go looking for that. But we're going to run through it very quickly here. So on the boat first, I am 5'10" and a half, and I'm about 80 kilos, and I ride a 138 board. Now, I'm probably towards the bigger end of that, however I still am absolutely fine. It's within my realms of possibility. But right now I'm going to put a rough sizing chart on the screen, and I'm going to put it in kgs and feet. Now obviously if you measure things in pounds and inches and centimeters, then just try and convert that on Google. But yeah, that's the rough sizing that I would go for on the boat. Now some people could say, whoa, you're way wrong, and sometimes you're maybe between two categories, and that's where personal preference comes into it. And if you're not sure, I can't stress enough, just try someone else's board and see what you feel like the size is like to ride. Cable, it's a bit different. Now there's a big phase at the moment to be riding gigantic boards, and personally, within reason, I think that's okay. So obviously I'm a 138 on the boat, but on the cable I'm on a 144. So there's a big difference there, but I wouldn't go any bigger than that on the cable, because I have tried bigger boards and I find then it's difficult to control. And whilst it's better on the rails, better for pressing, if you're into doing kickers or air tricks, which not many people are, but if you're into doing air tricks, or specifically kickers, which a lot of people are, the bigger board becomes quite a thing to control. And so that's why I would suggest maybe this sizing chart. Again, you can be in either side and it's okay to cross over, and at the end of the day, it's personal preference. So try out some people's boards at the cable and see what you like. And that leads me into weighting. So weight is a big question. People are always like, oh, your board's heavy, your board's light. And actually, I've been criticised many times throughout the years of your board's quite heavy. And it's not like supercars. So obviously supercars, the lighter the car, the faster it is, the better it can handle, everything like that. However, with wakeboarding, I actually think if you go too light, it becomes quite difficult to ride on. So a few years ago, everyone went down that route. I say a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now, all the manufacturers were trying to do a super light board. And what actually happened is you could genuinely notice it on the wind. Like, it was really hard to ride, and actually a little bit of swing weight, particularly when you start doing inverts and spins and you want that momentum, can actually be okay. So I wouldn't get caught up in the weight of things. Now what I will say is a light board and slightly heavier bindings, in my opinion, is better than a heavy board and light bindings. And it's all to do with the centre of gravity. Obviously keeping the centre of gravity as close to your body as possible is better, but a bit of swing weight isn't the end of the world. Okay, next we're going to delve into rocker. This is a phrase that's thrown around a lot, and most people don't know what it means. And I can honestly say, until I was about 17, which was about 7 years into wakeboarding, I didn't really understand what it was. And rocker effectively means the angle of the board. So it's the difference between here, here, and here. So the most common rockers are generally 3-stage, which effectively means 1, 2, 3, or progressive / continuous, which is a slower motion. Now to explain them, 3-stage tends to be a lot more aggressive. It tends to give you more pop, however landings tend to be a little bit heavier. And also the third thing to bear in mind is I personally find a progressive board is maybe easier to ride. So a progressive board is going to have a more consistent pop. So you might not get as much pop, but you will have a more consistent pop. So it's probably a little bit better for, again, beginner to intermediate. And also the landings are a little bit softer. Now it's not night and day, and being honest, if you're at a beginner level, you're probably not going to notice the biggest difference between the two. Then there is kind of 5-stage rockers, and then there's camber rockers that people have brought in, which is like opposite rocker. Personally, I think that's a bit of a fad. 5-stage is about as close to a progressive or continuous rocker as you can get. It has worked in the past with hybrid boards, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But long story short, I would advise going out and riding a 3-stage rocker board and riding a continuous or progressive stage rocker board, and comparing them, seeing what you prefer, and then deciding that's what you're going to go with. Now, often people early in their wakeboard life, they'll buy a 3-stage because they like the look of it, and they'll ride 3-stage for the rest of their lives. And it's the same with continuous or progressive. So it's not that important in your early days, but I would say in an ideal world, particularly on the boat, a continuous rocker is a little bit easier to ride. And last but not least is stance. Now this is a really potentially controversial thing, and I've no doubt I'll get roasted about this, but I think the super narrow stance is a bit of a phase, it's a bit of a fad, because scientifically speaking it makes no sense. Because who goes into the gym, gets the heaviest weight they can and puts their legs together? It's just not a thing. Everyone puts their legs apart, and it means that you can effectively have more balance. It means that the power is going through all the correct muscles up through your hips correctly. And so the whole skinny stance thing that's happening on cable, I do think it's going to blow over in the next 2 or 3 years, being truthfully honest. Now there was years ago where actually on the boat it was all about getting as wide of a stance as you could, and that also was wrong, because then you're actually putting too much pressure through your hips, not enough through your knees and your ankles, so it all changes there. What I would say is just go like this and see what feels about right. And also, don't be afraid to play with it. So obviously, I've had years in the Valhalla, and you can probably see my binding marks on this board because I rode this for a whole season and a half. But basically, I've figured it out now. I know where I like it on both boards. However, do play around with it. So maybe move it in, move it out. And actually, so a funny fact about me is on the cable, on the SOB that I ride, I actually find the spacing unusual for me. So what I have now started doing is I'll go 1 in here and 2 in on the bottom. So my board is not symmetrical. My angle binding facing is completely the same, but my board itself, where I'm stanced on the screws, are not symmetrical. And so many times I'm standing there and some kid or someone will turn around and go, "Man, you've got your bindings on wrong." And I'm like, no, it's just where it feels good. And I don't find it makes a difference. Obviously I can do most tricks both ways, switch and normal, and I still don't find it intervenes as long as the bindings are facing a separate way. Now, I was going to touch on bindings in this video and what bindings you should look for, things you should look for in bindings: closed toe, open toe, stance in terms of angles and everything like that. But I think that nearly needs a video in itself because it is quite an important feature. And sometimes I think bindings can actually be as important as boards when it comes to buying. But that is basically everything I want to cover in this video: sizing, rockers, boat versus cable, fins, stance. These are kind of the key questions that I see coming quite often, and I want to answer them. And I will say, when you're buying a new board, if you can, it's a little bit like a car. You want to test ride it beforehand. I know a lot of dealers probably can't do that, particularly with COVID, but maybe try and ask a friend, can you ride theirs, and try and fill it out for size, and then maybe fill out the rocker on another friend's board and see what you like. At the end of the day, I have one massive tip for anyone who's kind of beginner to intermediate level, who's looking to buy a new board. And if you've watched this far in the video, then you're going to gain from this. And it is, quite honestly, pick a board that you like the graphics. And I know that sounds so absurd, but when you look down and you're riding and you're happy with how your board looks under your feet, it's going to make you feel good, and then it's going to make you actually ride better. Particularly in those early stages where you don't know that much about boards and you can't tell the differences between maybe slight bits of rocker and diameter and things like that. It's only really the top percentage of riders who can really tell the difference. So pick something you like the look of, because at the end of the day you'll learn to ride it for its best ability, and that's kind of what really happens. So don't stress too much about all this stuff. But I know wakeboarders are like nerds and they like to know every spec on their board. So that is a very broad summary of buying a board. I hope it helps you. Let me know what you decide to buy, and if you have any questions, let us know in the comments, and me or maybe someone else can try and help you out there. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great one, guys, and we'll see you soon.